Spaceport 9 hung in the void like a battered crown, a neutral hub straddling the ragged boundary between the United Earth Concordance and the sprawling Khrazari Dominion. Orbiting a nameless gas giant in the neutral fringes of the Perseus Arm, it was a place where the galaxy's disparate races rubbed against one another in a constant friction of commerce, espionage, and barely contained violence. The port's skeletal framework, 30 kilometers of interlocking docks, habitation rings, and cargo spines, glowed with the ceaseless pulse of fusion lanterns and gravitic shielding. Inside its pressurized warrens, the air thrummed with the multilingual clamor of 1,000 species, the resonant keening of Vorani traders, the percussive clicks of Krell engineers, the low-frequency subsonics of the hulking Gorath haulers. Dana Ruiz moved through this chaos as if it were merely a crowded marketplace on a rainy Tuesday. At 42, she was a civilian dock supervisor, one of the thousands of human workers who kept the port's labyrinthine transit systems functioning. Her hands bore the permanent grime of mag seal repairs and conduit splicing, her dark hair was perpetually pulled into a practical braid, and her jumpsuit, stamped with the faded insignia of Ruiz Freight Solutions, hung loose on a frame hardened by 15 years of single motherhood and 12-hour shifts. She was neither soldier nor diplomat, just a woman who had raised her son alone after his father vanished in a reactor breach on a mining scow. Elias was 9 years old now, sharp-eyed and wiry, with his mother's unyielding temperament and a habit of dismantling broken machinery just to understand its secrets. That shift had begun like any other. Dana was overseeing a priority unload from a Khrazari bulk freighter when the inspectors arrived. The Khrazari Ascendancy was a federation of 6 warrior castes bound by a rigid code of dominance hierarchies, strength above all, submission enforced through ritual violence. Their soldiers, clad in angular exoskeletal armor that amplified their already formidable physiology, had a reputation for treating lesser species as provisional subordinates. This inspection party, 20 armored Khrazari, their mandibled faces masked behind translucent visors, had arrived without warning, claiming a need to verify manifests for contraband weaponry. The disruption began in Bay 17, a cavernous cargo vault lined with humming stasis racks and cargo claws. Dana was routing a pallet of antimatter containment cells when the lead inspector, a hulking sergeant named Vihorek, detached from his squad and strode toward the corner where Elias waited. The boy had been tasked with logging pallet seals on his tablet, a routine chore Dana allowed because it kept him close and earning his keep. He sat cross-legged on a packing crate, stylus in hand, oblivious to the armored procession until Vihorek loomed over him. The sergeant's visor irised wide, emitting a harsh ultraviolet pulse that swept the boy from head to toe. Elias flinched, shielding his eyes, and dropped his tablet. It clattered to the deck, scattering data chits. Before he could retrieve it, Vihorek's articulated gauntlet clamped around the device, lifting it from the floor with the casual precision of a hawk seizing prey. This juvenile interferes with authorized inspection, Vihorek declared in heavily accented Galstand. His voice, amplified through the suit's resonator, carried the guttural rasp of his species' throat sacs. It will submit to full biometric assay. Dana straightened from her crouched position beside a cargo stack, every nerve igniting. She had seen Khrazari inspections before, brutal, invasive procedures that involved neural mapping and physiological stress tests, the sort of examination reserved for suspected insurgents, not a child verifying shipping logs. She wiped lubricant from her hands on a rag and stepped between her son and the sergeant, her posture deceptively relaxed. He's not interfering. He dropped the tablet because your scanner blinded him. Give it back and he'll continue his work. Vihorek's mandibles parted in a reflexive display of dominance, serrated edges gleaming beneath the visor. The Khrazari did not parley with subordinates. Hierarchy was absolute. Defiance invited correction. He tilted his head, emitting a subsonic challenge pulse that made the deck plates vibrate. This soft-bodied larva scatters our protocols. It will be restrained and assayed to ensure no embedded sabotage. Step aside, mammal. Elias scrambled to his feet, his face pale but his jaw set. It's just a tablet. I wasn't doing anything. Dana's hand settled on his shoulder, not restraining him but anchoring him. She did not raise her voice. She did not retreat. Instead, she met the sergeant's visor squarely, her brown eyes unblinking in the harsh glare of the bay's overheads. No, the single word hung in the recycled air like the toll of a bell. Around them, the work of the bay stuttered. Dockhands, human and otherwise, paused in their labors, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure. Vihorek's squad closed ranks, their exosuits emitting a synchronized chorus of locking servos, but Dana did not move. You will clarify your insubordination, Vihorek growled, his gauntlet tightening around the tablet until its casing creaked. Or you will be removed. Dana took one deliberate step forward, shrinking the distance between them to half a meter. The sergeant outweighed her by a factor of 5, even without his armor. His species' skeletal structure was laced with cartilaginous struts that could fracture titanium. She was unarmed, unarmored, a civilian in a threadbare jumpsuit. Yet her voice carried the weight of something older and deeper than tactical assessment. "You're not touching my son. You're not scanning him. You're not restraining him. Drop the tablet and walk away, or this inspection ends here." The bay fell silent save for the omnipresent thrum of life support cyclers. Vhorek's mandibles flexed, tasting the chemical traces of her defiance, elevated cortisol laced with a steady, inexplicable flood of oxytocin. Human physiology, poorly understood even after 2 centuries of first contact, defied Khrazari behavioral models. Mammals were supposed to submit under duress, driven by self-preservation. This female did not. "You presume to dictate terms." Vhorek's resonator thrummed with incredulity. He raised the tablet like a trophy, its cracked screen reflecting the overhead lights. "You are one, unarmed, without rank or affiliation. I command 20 warriors of the Kresh caste." "Explain your presumption." Dana's pulse thundered in her ears, but her expression remained a mask of implacable calm. Fear coiled in her gut like a living thing, raw and primal, but she had faced worse than this. 15 years of raising a child alone in the ports, patching hull breaches with one hand while monitoring his vitals with the other, had forged her into something the Khrazari had no metric for. She was not fighting for dominance or resources or status. She was defending the one unbreakable line in her existence. "I'm a mother," she said simply, "and you're about to learn what happens when you try to take what belongs to one." Vhorek hesitated, a fractional delay in the seamless rhythm of his squad's advance. It was the first crack in the edifice of his certainty. Around the bay, human workers exchanged glances, welders pausing mid-arc, loaders setting down their harnesses, a cluster of technicians in the observation gallery falling silent. Something stirred in the recycled air, intangible but palpable like the gathering pressure before a storm. The sergeant made his decision. With deliberate slowness, he extended the mangled tablet toward the boy, but his voice carried the unmistakable prelude to escalation. "You will submit to assay, or you will be made to submit." Dana did not reach for the device. She stepped closer still, invading the sergeant's meticulously maintained dominance perimeter, her voice dropping to a tone that cut through the clamor of the bay like a plasma torch through hull plating. "Try it." In that moment, as the first of Vhorek's subordinates moved to flank her, the fragile equilibrium of the inspection shattered. And in the silence that followed, every human within earshot understood, with the clarity of a shared heartbeat, that the line had been crossed. But they did not yet know how far a mother's wrath would carry. The word hung in the fetid, pressurized air of Bay 17 like a detonator with its pin pulled. Vhorek's mandibles parted in a cascade of serrated clicks, the Khrazari equivalent of a bark of disbelief. No subordinate, least of all an unarmed female from a species whose warriors had never successfully challenged the Kresh caste, had ever breached the perimeter of dominance so brazenly. The sergeant's exosuit servos whined as he straightened to his full height, the articulated plates of his armor extending to amplify his presence. The squad behind him rippled with synchronized menace, their weapon systems cycling through low-ready protocols, energy projectors humming with contained violence. Dana Ruiz did not flinch. Her heart hammered against the cage of her ribs, a frantic percussion that threatened to drown out thought, but her body remained a monolith. She had known fear before watching Ilias' oxygen reserves bleed red during a micrometeoroid breach, clawing through twisted conduits to reach him before the scrubbers failed. That terror had forged her into a creature of deliberate, unyielding action. Fear was a signal, not a surrender. And now, with her son's hand trembling faintly in her grip, every ounce of that hard-won resolve poured into the space between her and the towering sergeant. "You dare invoke the prohibition of dominance." Vhorek's voice resonated through his suit's amplifiers, each syllable laced with the chemical reek of his outrage. His mandibles flexed, spraying a fine mist of dominance pheromones that set the air filtration units to whining. "You are no warrior. You bear no insignia of command. Your physiology registers cowardice, elevated epinephrine sympathetic surge. Yet you stand. Explain this illogic." Dana's eyes never left the visor that concealed his gaze. She could feel the weight of dozens of stares pressing against her back, the human dockworkers who had paused in their tasks, the alien contractors frozen in mid-motion, Ilia's small fingers tightening around hers. The bay's vast chamber, with its towering stacks of cargo pallets and the ceaseless throb of maglev rails, seemed to contract around them, every sound muted save the sergeant's breathing rasp. "I'm not trying to dominate you," she said, her voice carrying with the unadorned clarity of someone who had no time for posturing. "I'm telling you where the line is. You don't get to touch my son. You don't get to scan him. You don't get to restrain him. That's not a negotiation. That's a fact." A murmur rippled through the human workers, a low susurrus of exhaled breaths and shifting boots. Javier Torres, a burly fusion tech with a scarred forearm from a plasma manifold rupture, set down his calibration rig and took a single step forward. Beside him, Lena Markov, a Russian-born cargo rigger who had once held a collapsing bulkhead shut with her own body, straightened from her crouch atop a pallet stack. Neither spoke, but their presence marked the first fracture in the silence. Vihorek registered the movement with a twitch of his primary antennae, relayed through his suit's sensor array. His squad shifted formation, fanning out to establish a containment perimeter. The sergeant extended a secondary manipulator, seizing Elia's dropped data tablet and crushing it in a single, deliberate contraction. Polycarbonate shards rained onto the deck, glittering in the harsh overheads. "Facts are established by strength," he declared. "You have none. You will submit, or you and your larva will be removed to a secure holding vault for comprehensive assay." He gestured sharply, and two subordinates advanced, hulking figures whose armor plates bore the etched scars of ritual duels. Their manipulator claws unfolded, designed to restrain a fully armored Gorath without compromising structural integrity. Elias pressed closer to his mother, his breath hitching, but Dana did not retreat. Instead, she released his hand and took a step forward, planting herself squarely between her son and the approaching warriors. The nearest Khrazari paused, its manipulator halting a meter from her shoulder. The impossibility of the gesture defied every behavioral axiom in its programming. Prey did not advance on the hunter. Subordinates did not close distance under threat of physical compulsion. "Stop," Dana said. It was not a shout. It was the quiet, absolute command of a woman who had spent years commanding the obedience of a willful child in the face of exhaustion, injury, and the endless grind of survival. "You don't get to lay a hand on him." The Khrazari's visor pulsed with an interrogative strobe, its occupant struggling to parse the cascade of neurochemical data spilling from her. Elevated fear response, yes, but overlaid with a flood of protective hormones that saturated her system like a biochemical siege. Oxytocin, prolactin, vasopressin, a hormonal matrix reserved for intraspecific defense of dependent young, a pattern so primal and absolute that it defied suppression. Vihorek interjected, his voice a venomous hiss. "You cannot prevent it. Your biology betrays you. You are compelled to protect the larva, but compulsion bends before superior force." Dana's lips curved in a smile that held no trace of warmth or amusement. It was the smile of someone who had stared down the void and found it wanting. "You think you know my biology. You think you understand what happens when someone tries to take a child from its mother." She turned her head slightly, addressing the workers who had begun to converge around the confrontation. "Every one of you, you know what this is." The response was immediate and electric. Javier Torres spoke first, his voice rough from years of breathing recycled air laced with welding fumes. "Yeah, we know." Lena Markov dropped from her perch atop the pallet stack, landing with a clang that echoed through the bay. "You don't touch the kids, not for scans, not for inspections, not for anything." More voices joined the chorus, first in murmurs, then in a rising tide. Marcus Hale, a maintenance chief with a prosthetic leg from a docking clamp failure, shoved his toolkit onto a crate and stepped into the open space. Priya Singh, a logistics coordinator who had birthed her daughter in a medbay during a quarantine lockdown, folded her arms and stared down the nearest Khrazari warrior. Dozens of humans, dockhands, technicians, loaders, emerged from the shadows of the cargo racks, their movements unhurried but inexorable, like water seeping into the cracks of a fracturing hull. Vhorek's antennae lashed within their housings. His suit's tactical overlay painted the scene in escalating threat vectors. 67 humans now arrayed in a loose, decentralized formation, none armed, none in tactical configuration, yet their collective refusal to yield registered as an emergent threat greater than any organized military response. "This is insubordination," he snarled. "You will all be detained." Dana met his gaze unflinchingly. "Then detain us." The sergeant's squad tightened their perimeter, claws extending and suppression fields activating with a rising whine. But as the first manipulator reached for Dana's shoulder, Javier Torres moved, not in attack, but in perfect, unspoken unity. He placed himself between the warrior and the woman, arms spread wide. Lena Markov mirrored the action on the opposite flank, her posture a mirror of maternal ferocity. One by one, every human in the bay, parents, uncles, aunts, older siblings, stepped forward, forming a living wall that spanned the width of the cargo vault. They were not soldiers. They carried no weapons beyond the tools of their trade, welders, torque wrenches, cargo harnesses. But in their eyes burned a fire that no armor could extinguish, no hierarchy could contain. The Khrazari had cataloged humanity's military capabilities, dissected their strategies, mapped their physiological limits. But this was a force for which their doctrine held no precedent. Vhorek's voice broke across the command channel, summoning reinforcements from the port's auxiliary docking arms. But even as the first additional squads began their transit, doubt infiltrated the chemical certainty of his cast. These mammals were not defending territory or resources or dominance. They were willing to be crushed, one by one, for the sole purpose of preventing the removal of a single juvenile. And as the standoff hardened into something resembling a siege, Vhorek began to comprehend with dawning horror that the true battle had not yet begun. For when the reinforcements arrived, they would find not a lone female to subdue, but an entire port filled with humans who had drawn the same unbreakable line. The standoff in Bay 17 metastasized with the inexorable momentum of a hull breach. Vihorek's reinforcements arrived in a thunderous procession, 3 additional squads of Khrazari warriors, their drop pods slamming into the port's primary docking collar with the force of controlled detonations. 60 more armored figures poured into the bay, their exosuits synchronized in a flawless cascade of overlapping fields and interlocking fire arcs. The air thickened with the acrid bite of their maneuvering thrusters and the pervasive chemical signature of dominance pheromones, saturating the filtration systems until every breath carried the unmistakable scent of impending subjugation. From his command perch atop the central control dais, Vihorek surveyed the tableau with the cold precision of a strategist who had broken 12 planetary insurgencies. The human female Ruiz remained at the epicenter unmoved, her posture a defiant anchor amid the growing press of bodies. Flanking her were 87 humans, their formation disordered and devoid of tactical sophistication, yet impenetrable in its sheer, stubborn density. They had not drawn weapons. They had not adopted defensive postures. They simply occupied space, a living bulwark interposed between the Khrazari and the juvenile they refused to relinquish. "Disperse," Vihorek commanded, his voice booming through multiple amplifiers that reverberated off the vaulted cargo racks. "This is a lawful inspection under the terms of the Neutrality Compact. Interference constitutes rebellion. Yield and punitive measures will be limited to custodial restraint." Dana Ruiz did not respond immediately. She turned slowly, taking in the faces around her, the welders with scarred knuckles and calloused palms, the riggers whose backs bore the permanent curvature of decades hauling mass beyond human design limits, the parents who had raised their children in the cramped, radiation-leaking confines of star-hauling freighters. These were not warriors trained in the calculus of maneuver and firepower. They were the invisible architecture of galactic commerce, the hands that kept the ports breathing, the minds that improvised solutions when systems failed. And now every one of them had chosen to stand. "No," she said at last, her voice carrying without amplification, threading through the tension like a needle through reinforced plating. "You want my son, you want any of our children, you'll have to go through every one of us." The words ignited a chain reaction. From the shadowed upper galleries, where maintenance crews serviced the bay's overhead cranes, a woman's voice rang out. "You heard her. You want to scan the kids, you scan us first." It was Priya Singh, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, remembering the night her daughter had been born amidst a failing containment field, her own body braced against the buckling hatch until medics could reach them. She descended a maintenance ladder, dropping the last 10 meters to land amid her fellow workers, and took her place in the line. Others followed. From the sublevels, where auxiliary power cyclers thrummed like the heart of some buried leviathan, a cluster of freight handlers emerged, their coveralls streaked with hydraulic fluid and thermal paste. Elias Ruiz stood at his mother's side, clutching the remains of his shattered tablet, his small frame taut with the mingled terror and resolve of a boy who had never known his father but had learned from a mother who never yielded. Around them, the human presence swelled. 112, 147. They filled the bay's primary transit corridor, spilling into adjacent vaults, their numbers multiplying not through coordination, but through the shared, visceral understanding of a boundary violated. Vihorek's tactical feeds painted a cascade of anomalies. Human cortisol levels spiked across the board, yet their formation did not fracture. Instead, their neurochemical profiles exhibited a synchronized escalation, oxytocin flooding neural pathways, binding disparate individuals into a collective organism defined not by command structure, but by mutual commitment. The sergeant's doctrinal training offered no analog. Khrazari hierarchies were forged in blood and ritual submission. A subordinate who defied a superior was excised with surgical brutality, and the group endured. But these humans were willingly interposing themselves, placing their fragile, unarmored bodies between the threat and the objective, without hope of survival, without expectation of reward. "Madness," one of his lieutenants hissed through a private channel. "They cannot prevail. There are 211 combatants against 187 soft-bodied civilians. They are not fighting to prevail," Vihorek replied, his mandibles grinding against the interior of his visor. "They are fighting to prevent us from taking what they protect." He issued the order to advance. The Khrazari squads executed a textbook envelopment, 2 prongs sweeping along the cargo racks, a central force pushing directly toward the human cordon. Manipulator claws extended, suppression emitters charged to deliver non-lethal neural overloads capable of incapacitating a full-grown Salarian berserker. The warriors moved with the precision of a machine, expecting the mammalian herd to break under the inevitability of superior force. It did not. The first contact came in the central thrust. A Khrazari lieutenant reached for Dana Ruiz, his claw descending with the calculated restraint of a predator securing prey. Javier Torres intercepted it, wrenching a heavy torque wrench from his belt and jamming it into the manipulator's primary pivot joint. The tool bent but did not snap, forcing the claw to seize momentarily. Before the warrior could compensate, Lena Markov lunged from the opposite side, slamming a cargo restraint harness into the same joint, leveraging the full weight of her body to bind the articulated limb. Other humans piled on not in a frenzy of violence, but in a coordinated cascade of obstruction. Spools of conduit cable were thrown across advancing legs, locking their servos in tangles of unspooling polymer. Plasma cutters set to minimal discharge were triggered in overlapping bursts, filling the air with blinding flares that overloaded optical feeds and forced visor shutters. The Khrazari pressed forward, dragging the impediments with them, crushing tools and harnesses beneath relentless hydraulics. But for every meter gained, the human resistance adapted. A loader crew toppled an entire pallet stack, 6 tons of secured fuel cells, directly into the path of the left prong, forcing a full halt as structural integrity fields engaged to prevent catastrophic venting. Maintenance teams vented pressurized lubricant reservoirs into the deck grates, transforming the ferrocrete floor into a frictionless morass that sent 2 squads into uncontrolled slides. The humans did not seek to inflict casualties. They sought only to deny passage, to render every advance untenable, to ensure that reaching any child required traversing an unbreakable gauntlet of bodies and ingenuity. Vihorek watched as his meticulously ordered assault devolved into a grinding stalemate. Casualties were minimal, fractured manipulator housings, overloaded servos, but momentum had evaporated. The humans fought without fear of death, without regard for personal survival, their every action subordinated to a single, unassailable imperative: protect their own. Doubt infiltrated the sergeant's chemical certainty, a rare and unwelcome intruder. He had subdued rebellions that outnumbered his forces 10-1, broken species whose warriors exceeded his own in raw physicality. Yet this was not war as he understood it. Dana Ruiz stood unmoved at the heart of the maelstrom. Elias pressed against her side, her gaze fixed on Vihorek's dais. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in the halting advance of his warriors, the first fracture in their inexorable discipline. And in that moment she understood that the battle was no longer confined to Bay 17. Word had spread. Through the port's labyrinth of service tunnels, private comms, and whispered relays, the human workers of Spaceport 9 were awakening. Thousands of voices, united not by strategy, but by the primal fury of parents whose children had been threatened. The reinforcements Vihorek had summoned would arrive to find not a contained insurrection, but a conflagration that had already begun to consume the entire station. And as the first echoes of distant shouts reverberated through the connecting corridors, Vihorek realized, with a chill that penetrated even his armored isolation, that he had not merely provoked a single female. He had roused an entire species. The clamor of defiance spread through Spaceport 9 like a pressure wave racing through a compromised hull. What had begun as a single, unyielding stand in Bay 17 propagated through the port's tangled arteries, sublevel maintenance shafts, cargo transfer corridors, auxiliary docking spines. Human workers, isolated in their daily routines, received the signal through fragmented bursts, stolen comm messages, shouted relays echoing down transit tubes. The urgent flicker of handheld beacons passed from hand to hand. The message was simple, stripped of strategy or embellishment. They were coming for the children, every child, and no one would allow it. Dana Ruiz remained rooted at the center of the fray, her body a fixed point amid the escalating chaos. Elias clung to her side, his knuckles white around the jagged remnants of his data tablet, but his eyes no longer darted in panic. They burned with the reflected ferocity of his mother's resolve. Around them, the human cordon had become a living fortress, its contours shifting and reforming with each attempted breach. Tools became improvised impediments, monomolecular wire spools deployed to entangle manipulator limbs, thermal paste grenades smeared across deck plates to gum up servo housings, entire arrays of cargo clamps magnetized in cascading chains to immobilize advancing squads. Vihorek's reinforcements, now numbering nearly 200 warriors, hammered against the obstruction with methodical brutality. They tore through barricades of pallet stacks and severed restraint harnesses with fusion blades, their suppression fields crackling in sustained bursts that left human defenders staggering and disoriented. Yet for every breach they forced, the resistance reconstituted. A rigger who fell clutching a severed power conduit was replaced by 3 others. A collapsed cargo wall was rebuilt from adjacent stacks before the dust settled. The humans did not advance. They did not pursue. They simply refused to yield ground, transforming the bay into a labyrinth of deliberate obstruction where every step exacted a disproportionate toll. From the observation gallery overlooking the maelstrom, Vihorek's second-in-command, Lieutenant Kreshar, vented a stream of agitated pheromones. They expend themselves without purpose. They cannot hold indefinitely. Why do they not break? They are not holding for victory, Dana's voice cut through the din, projected through a salvaged public address unit seized from a nearby supervisor's station. She stood atop a pile of mangled cargo crates, flanked by Javier Torres and Lena Markov, her words carrying to every corner of the besieged vault. They are holding because letting you pass is not an option. You want to take our children, you'll have to kill every one of us first. The statement rippled outward, amplified by the growing chorus of human voices. It was not bravado, nor a calculated threat. It was a statement of inexorable truth, spoken without exaggeration or pretense, and it was heard far beyond the confines of Bay 17. In the neighboring vaults and transit spines, the response ignited. In cargo hold Delta 9, a team of 37 haulers, 20 of them parents, dropped their manifests and formed a shoulder-to-shoulder blockade across the primary access hatch, their cargo harnesses locked together in an unbreakable chain. In the primary engineering deck, maintenance crews vented all non-essential coolant lines, flooding the main corridor with a boiling fog that rendered optical targeting useless and forced Khrazari squads to advance blind. In the habitation rings, where families clustered in narrow crew quarters, human residents dragged their bunks and storage lockers into the central passageway, creating a nested series of barricades reinforced with every available tool and fixture. The scope of the uprising defied comprehension. Within the span of 20 standard minutes, every major transit route connecting the port's central hub to its peripheral docks was clogged with human bodies. Over 3,000 workers, dock hands, technicians, logistics coordinators, and support staff had abandoned their posts, not in flight but in deliberate collective refusal. They formed no command structure, issued no coordinated orders. Parents stood beside childless kin, united by the shared imperative of protection. Grandparents who had survived the Exodus Wars gripped torque levers beside teenagers who had never known a planetary surface. They wielded welders and restraint bolts not as weapons, but as the means to render themselves immovable. Vhorek's command feeds erupted in a cascade of conflicting reports, blocked corridors, stalled squads, cascading system failures engineered by humans who knew the port's every hidden access and failsafe. His warriors, bred for the clarity of hierarchical combat, found themselves mired in an enemy that refused the terms of engagement. There were no flanking maneuvers to counter, no command nodes to decapitate, no reserves to exhaust. The humans did not seek to expel the Khrazari from the port. They simply occupied every avenue of movement, ensuring that any attempt to isolate and seize a child required traversing a gauntlet of unrelenting opposition. For the first time in his career, Vhorek experienced the hollow gnaw of uncertainty. He activated his suit's primary broadcast array, addressing the human resistance directly. This is futile. You delay the inevitable. The Ascendancy has the authority of treaty and the preponderance of force. Submit, and your juveniles will be returned unharmed after verification. Persist, and you invite your own annihilation. Dana's response came without hesitation, relayed through the same commandeered channels. You still don't understand. It isn't about winning. It isn't about treaties or authority. It's about what happens when you try to take a child from its family. There is no submission. There is no negotiation. There is only the certainty that we will stand between you and them, no matter the cost. The words struck Vhorek like a misaligned thrust vector. He had studied humanity's military campaigns, their brutal tenacity in attritional warfare, their willingness to expend resources beyond rational limits. But this was something else entirely, a response rooted not in strategy or survival, but in a biological and cultural absolute. The data streams from his suit's biometric scanners confirmed it. Across the assembled masses, fear was present, but it was subsumed beneath a hormonal torrent of protective resolve. Entire populations were willing to be crushed, individually and collectively, for the singular purpose of denying access to their young. As the scope of the resistance expanded, Vhorek became aware of a subtler phenomenon. Amid the shouts and the grinding of makeshift barricades, small, disparate acts pierced the chaos. A father, blood streaming from a fractured scalp, knelt beside his son trapped in a collapsed bulkhead and whispered a prayer, words of surrender not to the enemy, but to some greater, unseen order. A grandmother, her hands trembling as she wedged a support strut into a narrowing breach, murmured, "This is no accident. There's purpose here, holding us together." In the flickering light of overloaded conduits, a cluster of workers bowed their heads for a fleeting moment, their silence more potent than any broadcast defiance. These acts registered as statistical noise, irrational behaviors without tactical value, yet they compounded the growing fracture in Vhorek's certainty. The humans fought as if assured of some deeper vindication, some force beyond mere survival that sustained them against annihilation. And then the full extent of their defiance became clear. From the port's command nexus, a new transmission flooded every open channel, a unified declaration from every human supervisor, administrator, and crew chief within Spaceport 9. All operations, cargo handling, maintenance protocols, life support management were suspended. Until every Khrazari inspector withdrew from every occupied sector, the port would remain inert, a deliberate total paralysis. Vihorek stared at the cascading alerts, fusion plants throttled to standby, gravitic stabilizers disengaged, docking clamps locked in full retraction. Spaceport 9, the vital artery through which a dozen sectors rooted their commerce, had been brought to a standstill. The sergeant understood at last that this was no mere rebellion. It was a demonstration, absolute and uncompromising, of a truth the Khrazari had never been compelled to confront, that there existed a force greater than their hierarchies, their warriors, their doctrines, and that force had now enveloped them entirely. The heart of Spaceport 9 had ceased to beat. The relentless pulse of commerce, the ceaseless migration of cargo pallets, the thunder of maglev rails, the orchestrated symphony of docking clamps engaging and releasing, had fallen silent. Every critical system, from primary power distribution to atmospheric scrubbers, had been systematically throttled to minimal function. The port, a nexus through which flowed the economic lifeblood of 12 contested sectors, now hung inert, its labyrinthine passages choked not by debris or sabotage, but by the deliberate, unyielding presence of its human workforce. Vihorek stood in the command nexus overlooking Bay 17, his armored form framed by the holographic cascade of failing systems. Tactical displays flickered with cascading alerts. 87% of primary transit corridors blocked, 43% of auxiliary power feeds manually isolated, docking operations suspended across all 31 spines. His warriors, distributed across the port in fragmented squads, reported the same reality in every sector: walls of human bodies, immovable and unrelenting. No amount of suppression fields, restraint clamps, or targeted breaches could dislodge them. For every defender pulled from a barricade, 3 others took their place, sealing the breach with whatever lay at hand: structural struts, coolant hoses, entire pallets of unspooled tether cable. The sergeant's mandibles worked silently behind his visor, grinding against the mounting dissonance between doctrine and reality. Khrazari operations proceeded through the systematic imposition of dominance: isolate, subdue, compel submission. Resistance was expected, but it broke under the weight of inexorable force. These humans did not break. They absorbed the violence, bodies bruised and bloodied, limbs pinned and dragged aside, and continued to fill the void they left. Their refusal was not a tactic, it was a fundamental condition of their existence. Dana Ruiz remained at the center of the containment zone that had once been Bay 17. The space had transformed into a seething mass of humanity, a densely packed throng that spanned the vaulted chamber and spilled into every connecting passageway. Elias stood beside her, his small frame wedged between her side and the shoulder of Javier Torres, who had refused evacuation despite a fractured collarbone, sustained when a Khrazari manipulator had thrown him into a cargo stack. Around them, the press of bodies generated a palpable heat, the air thick with the mingled scents of sweat, hydraulic fluid, and the metallic tang of blood. She could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing against her bones. Her arms ached from hours of hauling debris to reinforce barricades. Her throat was raw from shouting instructions over the din of collapsing restraints and discharging suppression fields. Doubt gnawed at the edges of her certainty, not fear of defeat, but the relentless arithmetic of endurance. They could hold as long as their bodies allowed, but bodies had limits. Oxygen, calories, the inexorable creep of fatigue. Yet even as her vision blurred at the edges, she saw no retreat in the faces around her. Woman with a plasma burn across her forearm continued to weld support braces into place. A father cradled a dislocated shoulder in one arm and dragged a collapsed pallet into a gap with the other. They were not fighting for survival. They were denying the enemy the one act they could not forgive. Vihorek's voice cut through the clamor, broadcast across every active channel in the port. This paralysis serves no purpose. The inspection is mandated by treaty. The juveniles will be examined, and your refusal achieves only mutual destruction. Dana seized a hand comm from a nearby technician and triggered its omnidirectional broadcast. Her voice, hoarse but unwavering, filled the corridors and compartments of the immobilized station. Destruction. You think this is about treaties, about what's mandated. You crossed a line when you tried to take our children. There is no treaty that lets you do that. There is no authority that makes it acceptable. We will stand here, every one of us, until you leave them alone. The words reverberated through the port, finding echoes in every human-occupied space. In the sublevel power vaults, a cluster of engineers knelt amid the dim glow of emergency lighting, their hands clasped in a brief shared silence. One of them, a gray-haired chief technician named Harlan Voss, lifted his head and murmured to his crew, "This isn't chance. Something bigger than us is holding this together." In a barricaded nursery module, a mother with 2 toddlers clinging to her legs traced the outline of a small silver cross necklace and whispered, "We're not alone in this." The words were not commands, not invocations. They were expressions of a conviction that required no explanation, rooted in a faith as instinctive as breath. Vihorek's lieutenants, observing the phenomenon through biometric feeds, struggled to categorize it. The human resistance exhibited no degradation in cohesion, despite measurable thresholds of physical exhaustion. Cortisol levels remained elevated, yet the expected cascade of panic and fragmentation did not occur. Instead, their collective hormonal profile stabilized into a unified matrix, oxytocin and endogenous opioids flooding neural pathways, forging disparate individuals into a single, unbreakable organism. It was as if the act of defense had become self-sustaining, a force that consumed its participants but granted them immunity from collapse. The sergeant initiated a direct confrontation, dispatching an elite honor guard to forcibly extract Dana Ruiz and a dozen other focal figures from the central cordon. The assault faltered before it began. The honor guard, 20 of the most decorated warriors of the Kresh caste, advanced into a deliberate kill box of layered barricades and improvised traps. Monofilament netting, laced with magnetized grapple lines, ensnared their lead elements, pinning hydraulic limbs in a web of interlocking restraints. Thermal flares, jury-rigged from discarded plasma torches, erupted in synchronized bursts, saturating the corridor with blinding radiance and corrosive vapor. The warriors fought through the obstructions, crushing netting and detonating flares with point defense emitters, but the human defenders did not engage them directly. They simply rebuilt behind the breach, sealing off the penetrated corridor with a fresh wall of bodies and debris before the vanguard could consolidate its position. For the first time in recorded Khrazari military history, an operation was halted not by decisive defeat, but by the absolute futility of continuation. Every advance demanded resources and time disproportionate to the objective. The port could not be compelled to function under duress. The children could not be reached without annihilating the entire human population. Vihorek retreated to a secured observation blister, his primary analyst compiling a summary of the engagement. The conclusion was inescapable. The humans were employing a strategy that defied all known paradigms of warfare. They were not seeking victory, nor even survival. They were enacting a categorical prohibition, willing to be erased entirely rather than permit a single violation of its terms. As the standoff endured, the sergeant began to perceive the shape of a truth that lay beyond the reach of his caste's axioms. This was not a display of strength, nor a bid for dominance. It was the manifestation of a force rooted in something more fundamental than hierarchy or survival, a willingness to sacrifice everything for the preservation of a singular, inviolable bond. And in the protracted silence that followed, as his forces stood immobilized amid a port reduced to stillness, Vihorek began to suspect that the true measure of power was not the capacity to compel submission, but the capacity to refuse it entirely, no matter the cost. For the humans had demonstrated that there was no limit to their refusal, no price too high to pay for the simple, absolute imperative of protecting their own. The silence that enveloped Spaceport 9 was more profound than any achieved through violence or mechanical failure. It was the silence of a living organism that had chosen to suspend its own functions, holding its breath in unyielding refusal. Every cargo spine lay dormant, every fusion manifold throttled to standby emissions, every gravitic stabilizer locked in null configuration. The port, a colossal engine of interstellar commerce, had become a monument to stillness, its every passage filled with the unmoving forms of human workers who had transformed themselves into barriers too vast and too numerous to be overcome. Within the central nexus of Bay 17, Dana Ruiz stood at the heart of this human citadel, her body trembling on the edge of collapse. The air was heavy with the mingled sense of exertion and strain, sweat-soaked fabric, the sharp ozone tang of overloaded circuits, the faint coppery undertone of blood where skin had split against unyielding metal. Her throat was stripped raw, her vision narrowed to a tunnel of flickering emergency lights, but she did not falter. Ilias remained pressed against her, his small frame rigid with fatigue, his eyes fixed on the armored figures that encircled them at a distance that no longer signified dominance. The Khrazari warriors had ceased their assaults. The cost of each incremental advance, servo failures from entangled restraints, thermal damage from improvised countermeasures, the relentless expenditure of suppression charges against targets that refused to yield, had rendered further coercion operationally meaningless. Vihorek's forces held their positions, but the initiative had irrevocably shifted. They occupied the spaces they had seized, yet those spaces were severed from purpose, isolated pockets in a port rendered functionally inert. Vihorek himself stood isolated in the command blister, his tactical feeds displaying a reality that defied every principle of force projection. The human resistance had achieved strategic paralysis without firing a single shot in the conventional sense. They had not assaulted his warriors, had not sought to drive them from the station. They had simply ensured that nothing else could occur until the single condition of their defiance was met: the withdrawal of every Khrazari inspector from every human-occupied sector. The sergeant's mandibles worked ceaselessly behind his visor, grappling with a form of conflict for which his training provided no resolution. He initiated a series of analytical protocols, attempting to dissect the phenomenon through the available data. Human casualties numbered in the hundreds: sprains, fractures, plasma burns, neural overloads from repeated suppression, but the rate of replacement exceeded the rate of removal. Biometric scans revealed a persistent elevation of protective hormones across the entire population, a chemical solidarity that suppressed the physiological imperatives of self-preservation. They endured because to do otherwise was to concede the one outcome they deemed unacceptable. Dana's voice, transmitted through a patchwork network of salvaged comms, reached him directly. "You can break every barricade. You can pull every one of us out of these corridors. It won't matter. There are always more of us, and every one of us will take our place. You cannot win this by force because we are not fighting for ground or power. We are standing between you and our children. That line does not move." The words carried the weight of absolute certainty, unadorned by rhetoric or exaggeration. Vhorek's primary analyst, a CAS specialist in behavioral prediction, transmitted a terse assessment. The human response constituted an absolute defensive reflex, comparable in its rigidity to the neural lockout that paralyzed a Khrazari warrior under ritual submission. Unlike submission, however, this reflex permitted no compromise, no graduated capitulation. The threat to their dependent young triggered a response that overrode all other behavioral imperatives, including survival. For the first time, Vhorek considered retreat not as a tactical expedient, but as a necessary concession to the nature of the enemy he faced. He ordered a partial withdrawal of forward squads, consolidating his forces to secure existing positions rather than pressing further into the impenetrable mass of bodies. The movement elicited no counterattack, no exploitation of the vacated space. The humans simply closed ranks, filling the emptied corridors with their unrelenting presence, ensuring that no avenue remained open for the resumption of inspections. In the exhausted intervals between surges of resistance, the humans revealed the deeper roots of their defiance. In barricaded compartments, where medics worked by the light of chemical lamps to bind wounds and reset fractures, small groups gathered in quiet acts of endurance. A father with a shattered wrist knelt amid the clutter of a collapsed cargo bay, his lips moving in a murmured prayer that asked for nothing more than the strength to continue standing. Nearby, a technician whose daughter slept in a secured creche module traced the outline of a worn medallion and said simply, "There's a reason we're still here. It isn't chance that keeps us upright." Another, her hands stained with coolant and blood, looked out through a rent in the hull plating at the distant curve of the gas giant and whispered to her companions, "All of this, the orbits, the balance, us holding together, it can't just be an accident." These moments, scattered and unorganized, formed a pattern that Vhorek's sensors could not quantify. The humans acted as though sustained by an external certainty, a conviction that their refusal was aligned with some larger order, some intelligence woven into the structure of events themselves. It was not a formal religion, nor a unified doctrine, but a pervasive undercurrent of belief that their persistence served a purpose beyond mere survival. As the standoff extended into its third standard day, the external pressure began to mount. Cargo convoys diverted to secondary ports, trade manifests collapsed under the weight of delay, diplomatic channels flooded with inquiries from neutral arbitrators, and Khrazari caste lords demanding resolution. The Ascendancy could not afford the indefinite immobilization of a primary transit nexus. Yet every attempt to reinitiate operations, whether through negotiation, coercion, or the deployment of additional forces, encountered the same implacable barrier: thousands of human bodies, willing to remain in place until their condition was met. Vhorek summoned Dana Ruiz to parley under truce protocols, establishing a narrow corridor between opposing lines. She approached without hesitation, flanked by Javier Torres and Lena Markov, her face a map of exhaustion etched with uncompromised resolve. Elias walked at her side, carrying a battered tool satchel that had become a symbol of their collective defiance. "You have achieved your objective," the sergeant stated flatly, his resonator stripped of dominance markers for the first time. "The port cannot function. My forces cannot proceed. What is the precise condition under which you will permit resumption of activity?" Dana regarded him steadily, her voice carrying the clarity of someone who had long since passed the threshold where fear no longer held sway. "Leave our children alone. No scans, no restraints, no assays. Withdraw every inspector from every sector where human families are present, and we will return to our duties." Vhorek's antennae twitched within their housings. "This is the entirety of your demand. It is the entirety of what matters." The sergeant stood in silence, his armored form immobile as the implications settled into place. He had come to Spaceport 9 expecting a routine assertion of dominance, a brief disruption followed by submission. What he had encountered was a force that operated under rules fundamentally alien to his understanding, a willingness to sacrifice all other priorities, economic function, physical integrity, operational continuity, for the absolute preservation of a single principle. And in that moment, Vihorek comprehended that the true measure of strength was not the capacity to impose one's will upon another, but the capacity to withhold compliance entirely, rendering all other forms of power irrelevant. But as the parley concluded and the lines held their uneasy stasis, a new transmission pierced the silence of the port, a priority signal from the Khrazari Caste Council, demanding that the inspections be completed at any cost. The question remained, would the price of completion prove greater than the Ascendancy was prepared to pay? The parley concluded without resolution, leaving the two forces arrayed in a tenuous equilibrium that neither side could sustain indefinitely. Vihorek returned to his command blister, where the unrelenting cascade of tactical displays painted a portrait of strategic paralysis. The human resistance had not advanced, had not sought to expel the Khrazari presence from the port. Yet their absolute refusal to yield had rendered every operational objective moot. The port remained a colossal monument to inaction, its corridors filled with the unmovable mass of human bodies, its systems locked in deliberate dormancy. The sergeant's hesitation proved temporary. From the heart of the Khrazari caste territories, a priority transmission arrived, bearing the unadorned authority of the Dominion's highest arbiters. The message was unequivocal: the inspections were to proceed. The alleged presence of prohibited weaponry within human cargo manifests constituted a direct challenge to the Ascendancy's treaty-guaranteed oversight rights. No disruption, however protracted, could be permitted to override the imperative of dominance. Additional forces, 5 full cohorts of Khrazari enforcers, supported by auxiliary units of subjugated client species, were already in transit, their deployment vectors locked onto Spaceport 9. Vihorek relayed the order to his assembled command cadre, framing it in the language of uncompromised hierarchy. The mammals will be compelled to disperse. The inspections will be completed. Prepare for systematic clearance operations. The announcement rippled through the human cordons like a shockwave through a pressurized chamber. Intercepted transmissions carried the full scope of the escalation. Hundreds more warriors, equipped with heavy restraint platforms and area denial fields designed to immobilize entire populations without permanent structural damage. The intent was clear: overwhelm the resistance through sheer, inexorable volume, dragging the obstructing bodies aside until the pathways to the children were cleared. Dana Ruiz received the intelligence from a network of scavenged sensor relays, her face hardening into lines of controlled fury. Exhaustion had carved deep shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands trembled faintly from sustained adrenaline depletion, but her voice remained steady as she addressed the assembled workers in Bay 17. They're bringing more of them. They think they can bury us under numbers. They think they can haul us away one by one until there's nothing left between them and our kids. She paused, scanning the faces surrounding her, faces smeared with grime and streaked with blood, eyes burning with a defiance that had long since transcended physical limits. They don't understand. Every one of us they pull down, every barricade they break, another takes its place. We don't stop because we're not fighting for territory or victory. We stop when they stop trying to touch our children. The words passed through the port's human-held spaces like a current, galvanizing the already unyielding resistance. Barricades were reinforced with every available resource. Structural members bolted into impenetrable lattices, emergency bulkheads manually overridden and welded into permanent closure, entire sublevel compartments sealed behind cascades of collapsed deck plating. Maintenance crews rigged auxiliary power taps to sustain localized life support, ensuring that the defenders could remain in place without compromising station integrity. Medics established triage points in every major strongpoint, treating injuries with the spare efficiency of those who had long since learned to endure. When the reinforcements arrived, the scale of the assault was unprecedented. Drop pods disgorged their armored payloads across 16 docking spines, flooding the port with nearly 900 additional warriors. Restraint platforms, massive, treaded constructs capable of physically relocating dozens of immobilized targets, rumbled through the outer corridors, their gravitic fields pulsing in synchronized waves designed to induce muscular lockup and neural shutdown. The humans met the onslaught without retreat. In every targeted sector, they transformed the pathways into gauntlets of calculated self-sacrifice. As the first restraint platforms advanced, crews collapsed sections of overhead infrastructure directly into their path, burying the machines under tons of twisted ferrocrete and severed support struts. Warriors who breached the debris were met not with direct assault, but with a relentless tide of obstruction. Bodies thrown into the treads to foul their locomotion, spools of high-tensile tether cable deployed to bind manipulator arrays, chemical suppressants vented from storage reservoirs to corrode hydraulic seals. Suppression fields swept through the corridors, dropping dozens of defenders into convulsing heaps, only for others to drag themselves forward on fractured limbs and occupy the vacated space. The brutality of the engagement mounted with each passing hour. Human casualties climbed into the thousands, broken bones, neural trauma, systemic shock from repeated field exposure, but the pattern held. Every cleared corridor was immediately resealed, every extracted defender replaced by others who had waited in reserve. The Khrazari advanced, meter by bloody meter, only to find their progress negated by the sheer volume of bodies willing to fill the void. Vihorek watched the operation unfold from his command nexus, his certainty eroding with each futile increment of penetration. The biometric data from captured humans revealed a phenomenon that defied all predictive models. As physical degradation intensified, so too did the intensity of their collective resolve. Fear responses were present, yet they were wholly subordinated to the protective imperative. Entire family units, parents, siblings, extended kin, interposed themselves without hesitation, their neural profiles exhibiting a unified cascade of self-abnegation. They were not merely enduring defeat, they were rendering the very concept of victory irrelevant. Amid the grinding attrition, the subtle thread of their conviction became impossible to ignore. In the shadowed interstices between clashes, where the clamor of restraint fields and collapsing barricades briefly abated, the humans continued their quiet observances. A mother, her legs pinned beneath a fallen support beam, clasped her daughter's hand and whispered a prayer that carried no plea for deliverance, only gratitude for the strength to remain. A cluster of injured workers, slumped against a ruptured bulkhead, shared a moment of silence, one of them murmuring, "This isn't chaos. There's order in it. Something wants us to hold." Another, coughing through bloodied lips, fixed his gaze on the armored forms advancing through the smoke and said simply, "We're still standing. That's not luck." These acts, fragmented and uncommanded, wove a pattern of unshakable endurance that began to fracture the foundations of Khrazari certainty. Vihorek's lieutenants, observing the unrelenting replacement of every fallen defender, transmitted increasingly urgent queries. What force could compel an entire population to expend itself without hope of survival, without prospect of dominance or reward? The sergeant had no answer. For the first time in his career, the inexorable machinery of force had encountered a counterforce that could not be compelled, negotiated, or destroyed. The humans were not invincible. They bled, they broke, they fell. But they could not be made to concede, and as the reinforcements expended themselves against an enemy that refused to yield its purpose, regardless of the scale of violence brought to bear, Vihorek began to comprehend the true dimensions of the power he faced. It was not the power to conquer, it was the power to deny conquest entirely. But even as this realization took root, a final escalation loomed: the arrival of the Caste Council's adjudicator, bearing the authority to declare total pacification, up to and including the systematic eradication of every human presence within the port. The question that now confronted the Khrazari was whether any measure of violence could compel submission from beings who had already proven willing to lose everything rather than permit a single violation of their unbreakable boundary. The arrival of the Caste adjudicator transformed the character of the conflict. Fleet Commander Terek, a towering figure clad in obsidian plate armor etched with the ritual scars of 100 dominance contests, descended upon Spaceport 9 in a flotilla of assault shuttles that blotted out the gas giant's banded horizon. He was no mere field commander, bound by the pragmatic calculus of operational limits. As an emissary of the High Dominance Council, his mandate was absolute: restore the hierarchy, complete the inspections, and impose submission by whatever means were required. Failure was not a permissible outcome. Erasure was. Terek wasted no words on parley. From the moment his boots struck the deck of the central command nexus, he issued a singular directive: total pacification. Every human obstructing the designated inspection routes was to be removed, by restraint, incapacitation, or, if necessary, elimination. Restraint platforms were supplemented with mass suppression arrays capable of inducing coma across entire compartments. Breach teams were authorized to employ lethal force against any individual who physically impeded their advance. The objective was no longer containment or extraction. It was the unequivocal reassertion of dominance, regardless of cost. The announcement cascaded through the port's occupied corridors, carried on every available channel. The humans received it without panic, without retreat. Dana Ruiz stood at the heart of Bay 17, surrounded by a cordon of exhausted but unbowed defenders, and spoke into a jury-rigged broadcast array. her voice, frayed to a ragged whisper yet carrying the weight of certainty, reached every barricaded vault and sealed passage. They're done asking. They're done with restraint. They will kill to get past us. But they still don't understand. Killing us does not create a path to our children. It does not break what we will not surrender. The final assault began in synchronized waves across the port's primary axes. Mass suppression arrays discharged in overlapping pulses, bathing entire corridors in neural disruptive fields that dropped hundreds of defenders into unconscious heaps. Breach teams followed, their fusion blades carving through barricades of fused metal and bolted debris, dragging limp bodies from the pathways. For the first time, lethal ordnance was brought to bear, focused plasma lances that burned through human flesh and bone with surgical indifference. The humans did not break. Those who remained conscious in the wake of the suppression waves crawled forward on shattered limbs, wedging themselves into the breaches with whatever remained of their strength. Others, roused from induced stupor by comrades who endured the fields to drag them upright, forced their trembling bodies back into the line. They wielded no weapons capable of penetrating Khrazari armor. They offered no coordinated counteroffensives. They simply refused to vacate the space between the warriors and their objective. Every corridor cleared was immediately reoccupied, every fallen defender replaced by others who had held themselves in reserve, waiting for the moment their presence was required. Tarek observed the carnage from an elevated tactical perch, his mandibles clamped in a rigid line of mounting disbelief. The cost of pacification escalated with each passing hour. Suppression arrays overheated and failed under sustained deployment. Breach teams, mired in the relentless cycle of obstruction, expended ordnance at rates that threatened to exhaust their reserves. Human casualties mounted into the thousands, bodies broken, burned, and lifeless, yet the pathways remained clogged. The dead were pulled aside by the living, who stepped forward to fill the void, their resolve undiminished by the certainty of their own destruction. For the adjudicator, trained to recognize and shatter every form of resistance, the phenomenon defied comprehension. He summoned Vihorak to his presence and demanded explanation. These mammals die by the hundreds, yet their obstruction persists. How is this possible? Where is the fracture point in their hierarchy? Vihorak's response was measured, stripped of doctrinal justification. There is no fracture point, Commander. They do not resist because they seek dominance or survival. They resist because to yield is to permit the taking of their dependent young. That outcome is unacceptable to them, more unacceptable than death itself. They cannot be compelled to move because they have already surrendered the imperative of self-preservation. Tarek's antennae lashed in rejection. All things yield before sufficient force. But as the assault ground forward, expending lives and materiel against an enemy that refused to be dislodged, even the adjudicator began to perceive the contours of an unassailable truth. The humans were not engaged in a contest for victory. They had removed themselves from the framework of conquest entirely. Victory, defeat, dominance, submission. These categories ceased to apply when the sole objective was to prevent a single, irrevocable violation, even at the price of annihilation. In the midst of the slaughter, the depth of their conviction revealed itself without fanfare. Amid the smoke and blood, where restraint fields left the air thrumming with residual static, a dying technician clasped a rosary strung on conduit wire and murmured words of surrender to a force beyond the violence consuming them. A father, his body half crushed beneath a collapsed bulkhead, locked eyes with his son on the far side of the barrier and whispered, "Keep them back. He's still watching over us." Another, her lungs filling with the acrid residue of plasma burns, looked into the unrelenting advance of armored warriors and said simply, "This cannot end with them taking our children. There is a line even death will not cross." These acts, uttered in the final moments of endurance, formed no strategy, no doctrine, yet they sustained a resistance that no application of force could break. Tarak, surrounded by the evidence of his own failure, the choked corridors, the depleted ordnance reserves, the unending replenishment of bodies, finally confronted the reality that lay beyond the reach of his understanding. The humans could be killed. They could be scattered, broken, erased, but they could not be made to permit the taking of their children. That prohibition was woven into the fabric of their being, a boundary that transcended survival, that no measure of violence, however absolute, could compel them to violate. As the assault faltered, its objectives unreachable despite the expenditure of every authorized resource, Tarek issued the order that marked the unraveling of his mandate. Withdrawal. The warriors disengaged, pulling back from corridors that remained filled with the defiant and the dead. Restraint platforms powered down, suppression arrays went silent, and the breach teams retreated to their staging zones. For the first time in the history of the Khrazari Ascendancy, an operation of enforced dominance had been terminated not by the submission of the subordinate, but by the absolute inability to achieve the designated objective. Dana Ruiz stood amid the wreckage of Bay 17, her body trembling on the edge of collapse, surrounded by the wounded, the dying, and the unbroken. Elias clung to her, untouched by blade or field, as were every child in the port. The cost of their stand was measured in shattered bodies and silenced voices, yet the line they had defended remained intact. Tarek faced her across the blood-streaked divide, his voice stripped of all pretense. "What are you?" Her answer came without hesitation, delivered in a voice that carried the weight of everything they had endured. "We are what happens when you threaten what we love." The withdrawal of the Khrazari forces unfolded in a silence more profound than the storm of violence that had preceded it. Restraint platforms retracted their treads, their massive forms grinding to a halt as servos powered down without command. Suppression arrays fell dormant, their disruptive fields dissipating into a low, fading hum. Breach teams, their armor scarred and their ordnance bays emptied, executed a phased retreat through corridors that remained choked with the bodies of those who had refused to move. No cheers rose from the human defenders. No triumphant broadcasts echoed through the ravaged port. There was only the ragged sound of breathing, the slow resumption of functions held in abeyance, and the quiet certainty of a line that had not been crossed. Dana Ruiz stood at the center of Bay 17, her body a map of endurance pushed beyond its limits. Bruises bloomed purple across her arms and shoulders where she had thrown herself against collapsing barricades. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, slick with a mixture of hydraulic fluid and the blood of those she had dragged to safety. Elias remained at her side, his face streaked with grime but unmarked by the violence that had raged around him. Around them lay the cost of their defiance, medics moving through the sprawl of wounded, dragging the fallen into makeshift triage zones, the air thick with the mingled scents of plasma-seared metal, spilled coolant, and the metallic tang of human blood. Fleet Commander Tarek stood at the edge of the cleared perimeter, his towering form isolated amid the wreckage of his failed pacification. The port remained functionally inert, its vital systems still under human control, every transit corridor occupied by those who had not yet yielded their positions. The adjudicator's mandibles worked slowly, tasting the chemical residue of defeat for the first time in a career defined by unopposed dominance. He activated his primary resonator, addressing the woman who had become the unyielding fulcrum of the confrontation. "Your objective has been achieved," he stated, his voice stripped of all hierarchical inflection. "The inspections have ceased. The juveniles remain unmolested. Explain this. What force permits you to expend yourselves without limit, to accept annihilation rather than permit the single prohibition?" Dana straightened, drawing a shallow breath through lungs raw from hours of unrelenting effort. She met the blank stare of his obsidian visor without hesitation, her voice carrying the clarity of exhaustion made absolute. "It is not a force. It is what we are. You measure strength by the ability to compel submission, to impose your will through violence or hierarchy. We do not fight to dominate you. We do not fight to survive. We stand because there are some things worth losing everything to protect. Our children are one of those things." She gestured to the surrounding devastation, the sprawl of broken bodies and shattered barricades, the silent ranks of humans who had not yet stepped aside. "You could have killed every one of us. You could have burned this port to slag and scattered our remains across the system, and it would not have mattered. Dead or alive, we would not have let you take them. Not one." Tarek's antennae shifted fractionally within their housings, parsing the implications of a behavioral paradigm that rendered all familiar metrics irrelevant. He had witnessed species crushed beneath the weight of Khrazari Ascendancy, their warriors broken and their populations compelled into submission. He had never encountered a people who could not be made to yield, not through violence, not through attrition, not through the certainty of their own destruction. The truth settled into place with the weight of an unassailable fact. The Khrazari understood power as a vertical axis, the strong commanding the weak, the dominant enforcing the subordinate. The humans had demonstrated a different order entirely, a horizontal unity forged not in submission, but in the shared refusal to permit violation of a fundamental boundary. It was a strength that did not seek to impose itself, did not require victory, and therefore could not be defeated by any conventional means. Dana continued, her voice gaining strength from the simplicity of the revelation. "You thought us weak because we have no empire to match yours, no warriors clad in armor that rivals your own. But weakness is yielding when you cannot endure further pain. We do not yield, not when it means allowing you to touch what we love. That is the difference between us." In the silence that followed, the humans began to move. Slowly, deliberately, they dismantled the barricades that had held for 3 unrelenting days. Bulkheads were unsealed, collapsed structures hauled aside, power feeds restored to their primary cyclers. The port resumed function, not as a concession to the Khrazari, but as the fulfillment of their stated condition. The children remained untouched. The line remained unbroken. Tarek watched as the station returned to operational status, its corridors emptying of bodies but filled with the quiet certainty of those who had paid the price of refusal. He issued the final order of withdrawal, directing his assembled forces, diminished, battered, and irrevocably altered, to evacuate all occupied sectors. As the last of the drop pods detached from the docking spines, sealing the Khrazari presence behind them, the adjudicator transmitted a single, unembellished report to the Caste Council. The inspections could not be completed. The objective was unreachable without the total eradication of the human population, an action that would achieve no strategic purpose. Spaceport 9 endured, its scars visible in fractured deck plates and emergency bulkheads fused into permanent memorials, but its purpose intact. The human workers resumed their duties, hauling cargo, repairing conduits, maintaining the ceaseless machinery of transit, not as subordinates compelled to obedience, but as those who had defined the terms under which they would continue. Dana Ruiz walked her son back to their assigned quarters, passing through corridors that bore the marks of their defense. She knelt before him, cupping his face in hands that would not stop shaking, and saw in his eyes the reflection of what they had become. Not conquerors, not invincible, but unbreakable in the face of a singular imperative. In the aftermath, as repair crews sealed the wounds of the uprising, and the port resumed its place in the flow of galactic commerce, the Khrazari learned a truth they could neither refute nor contain. They had catalogued humanity's weapons, mapped their strategies, quantified their physiological limits, but they had never comprehended the force that animated them when those limits were exceeded. You can shatter their bodies, you can burn their stations and scatter their fleets, you can bring every measure of violence to bear upon them, but you cannot make them permit you to take what they love. That refusal is absolute. And in its presence, all other forms of power, however vast, however inexorable, become nothing more than the clamor of blades striking an unyielding wall.